The story begins with Chris, a doctor who came to Switzerland for vacation. Chris was enjoying himself there a lot, but he met a girl named Annie. Though they were strangers at first, they quickly became friends. Chris and Annie decided to embark on their journey together. In no time, their relationship blossomed, and they eventually got married. They had everything a happy family could want. Chris and Annie also had 2 children named Ian and Mary, whom they loved dearly. One day, when Annie's children were returning from school, she requested her mother to pick them up because Annie had an important presentation at work. Unable to pick them up herself, she sent another driver. Little did Annie know that she would never see her children again, as they were tragically involved in an accident on their way home. Both Chris and Annie were deeply disturbed by the loss of their children, especially Annie, whose mental balance was shattered. Annie blamed herself for not picking up the children, as her absence might have prevented the accident. However, Chris supported and comforted her, gradually helping her cope with the situation. 5 years passed, and one day Annie called Chris at his clinic. She mentioned that some important paintings were coming from Russia, but hadn't arrived yet. Unsure of what to do, Chris suggested exhibiting the paintings and assured her that he would handle everything once he got home. Now Chris goes home to pick up all the paintings, but while passing through a tunnel, he sees several cars colliding with each other. Out of a sense of humanity, Chris was about to intervene to save them all when another car, out of control, directly hits him. Chris died instantly in this accident. When Annie learns of this, she is completely shattered. Just a few years ago, she lost both her sons, and now her husband was gone too. However, surprisingly, even after Chris's death, his soul had already left his body. Although Chris did not realize this in real life, he went to be with his wife. But when he began to understand that no other man could see him, Chris realized that he had died and that his soul had become separate. Chris always had a strange shadow about him that he didn't know about. In fact, Chris did not want to go away from his wife, so he became a soul and lived with her. Although Annie couldn't see Chris's soul, whenever she came close, she felt it, and this happened when Chris understood that she was increasingly saddened by his stay, so he decided to go there. Chris comes and tells everything that this is an imaginary world where whatever you think becomes real. That means, in this world, whatever comes, it becomes real with the help of your mind's thoughts and powers. That's why now Chris thinks he met his deceased son and daughters, Albert, to whom Chris had come to another place that was a different world. The whole world seemed like heaven where all things are possible which are not in the real world. Now after Albert goes to that place, another lady named Leona comes who started guiding Chris. Chris was saying that I have to meet the daughters because I am remembering them quite a lot. Then Leona explains to him that you have that moment, remember, when you were having a good time with your sons and daughters. Chris said that I always played chess with my daughter, but she never wins, and I have a toy house of heaven with her too. Leona says that even if your thinking is anything, you will get those things, but not in that way as you want. Now Leona starts showing her daughter inside Chris, and Chris hugs her with great love, and this whole world is made in the same way as Chris had thought. Chris spent all his time with his daughters after that. Albert comes back to Chris, but Albert provides a very shocking news here that he is told that your wife Annie has committed suicide, and Grass is totally shocked by this, but he is somewhere feeling good for his wife because Annie is having so many things. I had to deal with it and I couldn't bear it, and it would be good for her to give her life, but Albert says that the way you are thinking is not going to happen because your wife is not in heaven but has gone to hell because whoever committed suicide, a crime is considered, and he directly sentenced to hell. This is such a cycle in which none of them can come out, but Creasy has become very emotional because his wife had already seen such bad days, and now she is stuck in the world of hell. So Chris decided that he would somehow go to the world of hell and rescue his wife. However, Albert said that there are no rules and regulations in this world, so your wife should get a chance. With Albert, Chris had come to another person who could help them reach the gates of hell. He was a librarian who shows everyone the way, and now they started going towards the gates of hell through the paths of all three rivers. But in between, many bad souls came out from under the water to attack them. They had completely sunk the boat. Chris, the librarian, and Albert somehow managed to save their lives on the shore. All three had already reached near the gates of hell. But now suddenly, Chris's signals to meet his wife stopped coming because he was not thinking about his wife, but about his daughter Ian. Actually, Chris used to motivate his son Ian a lot to become a good person in childhood. Ian also used to listen to his father very well. Then after a while, Chris realized that Albert is not someone else, but his son in another form. Albert also tells his reality, due to which both had met each other, but now the librarian said that now you have met your son, so we cannot take Albert further because you will continue to think about him in your mind, and then we will not get signals of your wife Annie. So now Chris and the librarian started going inside the gates of hell together. Now the librarian directly entered inside the gates of hell with Chris, where there was a very flat surface. Many bad souls were present there whose heads were outside. Chris searches around in every way and finally saw the head of his wife as soon as he went to save her. Then Chris starts falling from a height. Now he and the librarian enter a very large trench, which was quite scary. Chris had to go alone to meet his wife from here, so the librarian is telling that maybe you get some result of this because your wife is stuck in such a cycle that she cannot remember anything. But do not forget this thing that whenever you meet your wife's soul, do not wait more than 3 minutes there because this world will start dominating you too, and you will also forget all things and get stuck here only. Keeping all these things in mind, Chris walks away. To save his wife Annie, who was sitting completely distraught on the side, Chris called out to her. It became clear that Annie didn't recognize him at all. She was asking Chris to stay away because she believed no harm could reach her. Despite many attempts to explain, Annie couldn't recall anything. Chris, now deeply disappointed, went to the librarian. The librarian had already said that there was no point in this matter. Annie was completely stuck here, and no one could get her out. But Chris made one last attempt and went to his wife. He began confessing everything, whose fault it was and whose wasn't. Chris reminded Annie that although their children had died, they had supported each other afterward and remained together. Gradually, Annie started remembering some things, because the love between Annie and Chris was indeed very true. However, Annie still blamed herself for the deaths of her children and husband. Chris made Annie realize that no one was at fault, and if someone's time had come, they would go one day. After explaining everything, Annie stopped blaming herself and started remembering everything. Their souls embraced each other, and a bright light shone. When Chris opened his eyes, he had arrived in heaven, a beautiful, imaginative world. What was surprising was that Annie had also arrived there. With their 2 children, Chris managed to save his wife, and they could now peacefully spend their future lives in heaven. And with this, our adventurous story ends here.